The call came in at 11:52 on a Tuesday night in January 1978. A young woman was missing from her sorority house at Florida State University. The door to her room was open. Her shoes were still by the bed. Her textbooks were spread across the desk like she'd just stepped out for a moment and planned to come right back. But she didn't come back, and the man responsible had already been in prison once. He'd already escaped twice. Law enforcement in 3 different states had already connected his name to more than a dozen murders. And still, somehow, he was standing in Tallahassee, Florida, renting a room under a fake name, living 3 blocks from a college campus, completely invisible to the people who were supposed to be hunting him. To understand how that happened, how a man who was one of the most wanted fugitives in the country walked free long enough to kill again, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to his childhood, not to his psychology. You have to go back to the first time a detective looked at a stack of missing persons reports and felt something cold settle in his stomach. Something that told him these cases weren't separate. They were one case, one person, and whoever it was, they were very, very good at disappearing. The Pacific Northwest in the early 1970s was a particular kind of place. Seattle was a working city. Boeing factories, fishing docks, rain that came in sideways off Puget Sound from October through May. The University of Washington sat in the northern part of the city, a campus of red brick and Douglas fir, surrounded by neighborhoods of small houses and coffee shops and used bookstores. The avenue, University Way Northeast, ran through the heart of the district, lined with record stores and cheap diners and bulletin boards papered over with concert flyers and apartment listings. Young women walked to class alone in the mornings. They hitchhiked. They trusted strangers in the way that people trust strangers when they've never had a reason not to. Between 1974 and 1975, that trust became a liability. In January 1974, 18-year-old Joni Lentz was found in her bedroom in a University District rooming house on 12th Avenue Northeast, beaten so severely that she never fully recovered. She had been struck with a metal rod pulled from her own bed frame. She survived, but she couldn't identify her attacker. The room showed no signs of forced entry. Whoever had been there had come in through an unlocked door, done what they came to do, and left without a sound, while 5 other women slept in the same building. 6 weeks later, on February 1st, Linda Ann Healy, a 21-year-old student, a weather reporter for a local radio station called KOMO, someone with a life full of appointments and obligations, vanished from her basement bedroom on 12th Avenue Northeast, less than a mile from where Joni Lentz had been attacked. Her roommates found her bed neatly made. Her nightgown was folded on the pillow. Her backpack was gone. There was a small bloodstain on the pillowcase, barely the size of a hand, that her roommates initially thought was nothing. It was not nothing. She was never seen alive again. After Healy, the disappearances came with a rhythm that investigators didn't immediately recognize as a rhythm. Donna Manson, 19, a student at Evergreen State College in Olympia, gone in March while walking to a jazz concert on campus. Susan Rancourt, 18, gone in April from Central Washington State College in Ellensburg. She had been walking to a meeting of the campus film club at around 11 at night. Roberta Parks, 22, gone in May from Oregon State University in Corvallis, more than 200 miles south of Seattle. Brenda Ball, 22, gone in June from the Flame Tavern in Burien. Georgian Hawkins, 18, gone in July from an alley behind her sorority house at the University of Washington, an alley she had walked dozens of times before, each of them young, each of them last seen near a college campus or a crowded parking lot, each of them simply gone. No bodies, no witnesses, no physical evidence left behind, no sign of struggle, no farewell, just the ordinary details of a normal evening, and then nothing. The King County Sheriff's Office opened files. The Seattle Police Department opened files. Detectives in counties across Washington state opened files. But in 1974, there was no national database linking missing persons cases across jurisdictions. There was no system that would flag the pattern. A disappearance in Ellensburg, and a disappearance in Corvallis, and a disappearance in Seattle were three separate cases in three separate filing systems in three separate agencies that had no routine mechanism for talking to each other. Each disappearance looked, on paper, like its own isolated tragedy. A young woman who left a party and didn't come home. A student who walked to the library and never arrived. It took a detective named Robert Keppel, working out of the King County Sheriff's Office, to start pulling the threads together. Keppel was 25 years old in 1974, newly assigned to the Major Crimes Unit, and he approached the accumulating files with the kind of methodical attention that the case demanded. Not dramatic, not intuitive in the Hollywood sense, just relentlessly organized. He built a matrix: age range, physical description, last known location, time of day, method of disappearance. He cross-referenced what little physical evidence existed. He called detectives in other counties and asked questions that, at the time, probably seemed overly theoretical. Had they noticed a similar profile in their missing persons cases? Had anyone reported a man with a cast or a sling asking for help near a parking lot? By the summer of 1974, Keppel had a working theory. These weren't separate cases. This was a single offender, someone mobile, willing to drive 200 miles between crimes. Someone organized, leaving no evidence, choosing victims in public places, managing the approach and the disappearance with a precision that suggested planning rather than impulse. Someone who had figured out how to make people vanish cleanly, in broad daylight, from populated places, without anyone seeing anything useful. What he didn't have was a name. The name came from an unexpected direction, and it came more than once, which made it impossible to ignore. On July 14, 1974, Lake Sammamish State Park, a large recreational area about 15 miles east of Seattle on the shore of Lake Sammamish, was crowded. It was a Sunday in the middle of summer, temperatures in the mid-70s, and approximately 40,000 people had come out to swim, picnic, and boat. It was, by every measure, one of the safest seeming places in the Pacific Northwest that day. Witnesses later told investigators about a young man they had seen approaching women on the beach throughout the afternoon. He was described consistently: good-looking, clean-cut, well-spoken, with light brown hair and an arm in a sling. He introduced himself as Ted. He said he was having trouble with his sailboat and asked women to help him carry it to his car, a tan-colored Volkswagen Beetle parked in the lot above the beach. Several women declined. 2 did not. Janice Ott, 23, a probation caseworker, left the beach with him at around noon. She was seen walking up the path toward the parking lot. She was never seen again. Denise Naslund, 19, a computer science student, disappeared from the same park later that same afternoon, within sight of friends who were waiting for her to come back from the restroom. She did not come back from the restroom. She was never seen again. 2 women, 1 park, 1 day, 40,000 witnesses, and the only description investigators had was a first name and a tan Volkswagen. The King County Sheriff's Office distributed a composite sketch and asked for tips. What came back was a flood, hundreds of calls over the following weeks, and somewhere inside that flood, multiple callers independently gave the same name, not prompted, not in response to a specific question, just offered separately by people who had known him in different contexts. Ted Bundy. He was a law student at the University of Utah by then, having transferred after completing a psychology degree at the University of Washington. He had worked as a volunteer on the 1972 gubernatorial campaign of Daniel Evans, the Republican candidate who won. He had volunteered at a Seattle crisis hotline, answering calls from people in psychological distress. He had been described by a supervisor at that hotline, a woman named Ann Rule, who would later write the definitive account of his crimes, as one of the most empathetic volunteers she had ever worked with. People who knew him used words like charismatic and intelligent and helpful. His girlfriend of several years described him as attentive and warm. Detectives in King County ran the name. They interviewed him in the fall of 1974. He was cooperative and articulate. He had explanations for his whereabouts. He acknowledged owning a Volkswagen Beetle, but said he had sold it. He was calm throughout the interview. Not nervous, not evasive, just calm. When the interview ended, the detectives noted his name in the file and moved on to other leads. There were hundreds of other leads. The tip line had generated more than 3,000 names by the end of 1974. His file sat in a drawer in the King County Sheriff's Office for another year. By the fall of 1974, the disappearances in Washington had stopped. Investigators didn't know whether to read that as progress or as a shift, whether the offender had been scared off, had moved, or had simply changed his method. The answer became clear in November, when cases began to surface in Utah. Carol DeRonch was the case that almost broke things open early. On the evening of November 8, 1974, she was shopping at the Fashion Place Mall in Murray, Utah, a suburb of Salt Lake City, when a man approached her near the bookstore. He was well dressed, a sport coat, neat hair, and easy manner. He identified himself as Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department. He told her someone had attempted to break into her car in the parking lot and asked her to come with him to file a report. She was 18 years old. He was a man in a sport coat who had said he was a police officer. She got into his car. It was a tan Volkswagen Beetle. He drove away from the mall, away from the direction of any police station, and pulled over on a side street. He snapped a handcuff onto her left wrist and reached under the seat for a crowbar. She screamed. She grabbed the door handle. He swung the crowbar at her head and missed. She got the door open, threw herself out onto the pavement, and ran toward the headlights of an approaching car. The driver stopped. She got in. She was shaking so hard she could barely speak. She survived. Her description of the man, calm, well-dressed, plausible, driving a tan VW Beetle, matched what witnesses at Lake Sammamish had described 6 months earlier. And on the same night that Carol DeRonch fought her way out of that car, a 17-year-old girl named Debbie Kent vanished from the parking lot of Viewmont High School in Bountiful, Utah, where she had been watching a school play. A handcuff key was found in that parking lot the following morning. It matched the cuffs that had been locked onto Carol DeRonch's wrist. Utah detectives and King County detectives were now looking at the same case from opposite ends of a very long road, but the investigations were running in parallel, not in coordination. There was no shared suspect list. There was no mechanism for one agency to flag a name that had appeared in another agency's tip file. The name Ted Bundy had surfaced in Washington. In Utah, investigators were building their own list from scratch. Then the evidence from the mountains outside Salt Lake City changed the scope of everything. In the summer of 1975, hikers found skeletal remains on a forested ridge called Taylor Mountain, about 30 miles southeast of Seattle, and in a wooded canyon near Issaquah. Over the following weeks, forensic investigators recovered the remains of 4 of the women who had disappeared in Washington state: Linda Ann Healy, Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, and Roberta Parks, all at the same site. They had been there for more than a year, exposed to a full winter and spring. Physical evidence was sparse, but the location confirmed what Keppel had suspected from the beginning: one person, one series of crimes, and a willingness to travel across state lines that most investigators still hadn't fully accounted for. The arrest, when it finally came, was almost accidental. On August 16, 1975, a Utah Highway Patrol officer named Bob Hayward was driving through a quiet residential neighborhood in Granger, a suburb of Salt Lake City, when he noticed a tan Volkswagen Beetle parked with its headlights off near a drive-in theater that had been closed for months. It was past midnight. The car pulled away as the officer approached. He ran the plates and pulled the car over on a nearby street. The driver was cooperative and polite. He said he had been to see a movie. Officer Hayward noted that the drive-in had been shuttered since the spring. He asked to search the car. The driver consented. Inside the Volkswagen, Hayward found a ski mask, a second mask fashioned from a pair of pantyhose, a crowbar, a length of rope, handcuffs, an ice pick, and a bag of torn strips of cloth. Taken individually, each item had an innocent explanation. Taken together, in a car whose driver had just lied about where he'd been, they told a different story. The driver's name was Theodore Robert Bundy. He was 28 years old. The tools in the car were enough to hold him on suspicion. Carol DeRonch was brought in for a lineup. She walked along the row of men, stopped, and pointed without hesitation. "That's him," she said. "That's the man who put the handcuffs on me." In March 1976, after a trial in which DeRonch testified for more than 2 hours, Bundy was convicted of aggravated kidnapping and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison at Point of the Mountain. It was the first conviction. It was, by any measure, a fraction of what investigators believed him responsible for. But it was enough to keep him confined while the larger case was assembled. Colorado had been watching. In 1975, 3 women had been murdered in mountain resort towns: Karen Campbell in Snowmass Village in January, Julie Cunningham in Vail in March, Denise Oliverson in Grand Junction in April. The physical evidence and the pattern of approach linked those cases to the Washington disappearances. Colorado prosecutors filed a murder charge against Bundy while he was still in Utah custody. In January 1977, he was transferred to Pitkin County, Colorado, to stand trial for the murder of Karen Campbell, a 23-year-old nurse who had vanished from the second-floor hallway of the Wildwood Inn while walking from the elevator to her room. He had waived his right to appointed counsel. He was, in the eyes of the court, his own attorney. And on June 7th, 1977, during a recess in a pretrial hearing at the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, Theodore Bundy walked to the courthouse law library on the second floor, opened a window that faced a 12-foot drop to a flower bed below, and jumped. He landed, got up, and walked east into town. He had no money, no change of clothes, no map, and no plan beyond the moment of landing. He made it 8 days, wandering through the mountains above Aspen, losing weight, sleeping in abandoned cabins, stealing food from a vacation home, before a Pitkin County deputy found him driving erratically on a mountain road in a car he had stolen from a parking lot. He had lost approximately 15 pounds. He was disoriented and dehydrated. Deputies brought him back to Aspen. Security was tightened. His movements were restricted. And then, on December the 30th, 1977, he escaped again. The second escape was different. This one had been planned for months. Bundy had been quietly losing weight since the fall. He told the guards he was on a health kick, watching his diet. What he was actually doing was measuring a gap in the ceiling of his cell at the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs. A light fixture access panel, approximately 12 inches square, set into the ceiling above his bunk. He had obtained a small hacksaw blade and worked at the panel's edges over a period of weeks. By December, he calculated that he had lost enough weight, somewhere between 30 and 35 pounds, from an already lean frame to fit through it. On the night of December 30th, the jail was short-staffed. The holidays had reduced the duty roster. The jailer, who normally monitored his cell block, had gone home early. At some point after midnight, Bundy climbed onto his bunk, pushed through the ceiling panel, and crawled through the space above the cell block, a narrow crawl space, insulation and pipes and darkness, until he reached the apartment of the chief jailer, which was located directly above the jail and happened to be empty that night. The jailer and his wife had gone out for the evening. Bundy dropped through a second ceiling panel into the apartment. He found street clothes in the closet. He dressed, walked down the interior stairs, and went out through the front door of the building. It was 17 hours before anyone noticed he was gone. The morning shift assumed the day shift had checked on him. The day shift assumed the night shift had done it. By the time a guard actually looked into his cell on the afternoon of December 31st, Bundy had been free for the better part of a day. He hitchhiked to Aspen, caught a Greyhound bus to Denver, flew from Denver to Chicago on a ticket purchased with a stolen credit card, took an Amtrak train from Chicago to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and then traveled south by bus through Atlanta and into Florida. He arrived in Tallahassee on January 8th, 1978. He rented a room at a boarding house on Dunwoody Street, 3 blocks from the Florida State University campus, telling the landlord his name was Chris Hagen. He paid his first week's rent, $30 in cash. He had been free for 9 days. His face had appeared on the news. The FBI had been notified. Colorado had issued a fugitive warrant, and he was walking around a college campus in Florida, going to the library, eating at the cafeteria, watching the students around him completely unrecognized. He stayed for 5 weeks. What happened in the early morning hours of January 15th, 1978 is documented in police reports, in crime scene photographs, in the testimony of survivors, and in the statements of investigators who spent decades trying to make sense of what they found. At approximately 3 a.m., Someone entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University through the back door. The lock on that door had been reported as faulty to the university maintenance department weeks earlier. The work order had not been completed. The intruder moved through the house quietly, through a back hallway, up a staircase, and into the sleeping rooms on the second floor, while 39 women slept. Lisa Levy, 21, a junior from St. Petersburg, and Margaret Bowman, 21, a senior from St. Petersburg, were murdered in their rooms. Two other women, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, both 21, were beaten severely in their beds, but survived. A fifth woman, Cheryl Thomas, was attacked in her apartment 8 blocks away on Dunwoody Street within the same hour. She survived, but the injuries she sustained, a skull fracture, damage to her inner ear, left her with permanent hearing loss and a vestibular disorder that destroyed her sense of balance. She had been a dance major. She had been planning to audition for a professional company that spring. The attack on the Chi Omega house lasted less than 15 minutes, from the time the intruder entered to the time he left. 15 minutes. 39 women in the building, 4 attacked, 2 dead. Tallahassee police responded before dawn. The campus was locked down by 6 a.m. Students were told to stay in their rooms, to lock their windows, to call campus security if they heard anything unusual. The university, which had been quiet and ordinary 12 hours earlier, was now a crime scene of a scale that the Tallahassee Police Department had never encountered in its history. The lead investigator, a detective named Don Patchen, noted 2 things immediately. The first was the level of discipline the attacker had shown. Entering and exiting a building full of potential witnesses without being seen or heard, striking multiple victims in a compressed window of time, leaving the scene before anyone raised an alarm. The second was the bite marks. On one of the victims, there were clear impressions left in the skin, a double arc, upper and lower teeth, with distinct individual characteristics. Bite mark evidence was a relatively new area of forensic analysis in 1978, but Patchen flagged it immediately and called in a forensic odontologist. The marks were photographed, measured, and preserved. If they could be matched to a specific set of teeth, they would be among the most individualized physical evidence the case had. What Patchen didn't know, standing in that sorority house at 4 a.m, with the smell of coffee coming from a neighbor's window and the sound of police radios crackling in the hallway, was that the man he was looking for was still in Tallahassee, still sleeping in his rented room on Dunwoody Street, 3 blocks away, still going to the university library the next morning, still eating at the same restaurants near campus, still walking the same sidewalks as the students whose lives he had just shattered. He stayed for 3 more weeks. On February 8, 1978, a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach disappeared from Lake City, Florida, a small city of about 10,000 people, approximately 100 miles east of Tallahassee on Interstate 10. She was a 7th grader at Lake City Junior High School. She had left her homeroom class at around 9 a.m. to retrieve a purse she had forgotten in another building. A witness, a fellow student, later told investigators he had seen a man in the school parking lot speak briefly to a girl, matching her description, and then lead her toward a white van. Kimberly Leach did not return to her homeroom. She did not come home that afternoon. Her parents reported her missing that evening. Her body was found 8 weeks later, on April 7th, by a state wildlife officer conducting a routine survey in Suwannee River State Park in Hamilton County. She had been left in a deteriorating outbuilding at the edge of the park. She was 12 years old. She was the youngest of his confirmed victims. She was also the last. By the time Kimberly Leach disappeared, Bundy had already left Tallahassee. He had stolen a car, a white Dodge van, then later an orange Volkswagen Beetle, and was moving west through the Florida Panhandle toward Pensacola. He was using stolen credit cards under the name of a Florida State student whose wallet he had taken. He was staying in cheap motels, paying cash when he had it, charging meals and gas when he didn't. He was running out of money. He was running out of aliases. And he was, though he had no way of knowing it, running out of road. On February 15th, 1978, at approximately 1:30 in the morning, a Pensacola police officer named David Lee was on patrol in a residential neighborhood near the intersection of Cervantes Street and 9th Avenue when he ran the plates on a Volkswagen Beetle parked at an odd angle near a curb. The plates came back as stolen, taken from a vehicle in Tallahassee. He approached the car. The driver started the engine and pulled away. Officer Lee followed, called for backup, and when the car stopped, approached on foot. The driver got out of the car and ran. He was fast, younger than Lee had expected, lean, moving hard through a dark residential block. Lee tackled him in a yard, 2 houses down. There was a struggle. The man fought in a way that felt to Lee less like panic and more like calculation, testing leverage, testing angles, looking for an opening. Lee held him. Backup arrived within 90 seconds. The man gave a false name when booked. He said he was Kenneth Misner, a student. He had no identification. He fought the booking process. At one point, in the middle of the struggle, he said something to Officer Lee that the officer would repeat in interviews for years afterward. He said, "I wish you had killed me." It took investigators less than 24 hours to confirm his real identity through fingerprint comparison. Theodore Bundy was in custody for the last time. He was 31 years old. He had been free for 46 days since his escape from Glenwood Springs. The trials that followed were, in their own way, as strange and as revealing as everything that had preceded them. Bundy arrived in Tallahassee in June 1979 for the Chi Omega trial and immediately moved to represent himself, dismissing the public defenders who had been working his case for months. The decision was not entirely irrational from a strategic standpoint. It gave him control of the courtroom, access to evidence, and the ability to delay proceedings through procedural motions. But it also placed him every day in front of a jury that was watching a man accused of murdering 2 sleeping women cross-examine the witnesses who had survived him. The courtroom was packed for every session. Television cameras had been permitted under a Florida pilot program that was, at the time, highly unusual. Most American courtrooms had no cameras at all. Portions of the proceedings were broadcast nationally, and for many Americans watching at home in the summer of 1979, it was their first sustained look at a man accused of multiple murders, performing his own defense with apparent composure. He wore a suit. He took notes. He objected on procedural grounds. He addressed the judge as "Your Honor," with the fluency of someone who had spent 3 years in law school. The bite mark evidence was the prosecution's most powerful single piece of testimony. A forensic odontologist named Dr. Richard Souveron from the Dade County Medical Examiner's Office testified that the impressions left on Lisa Levy matched the specific and irregular pattern of Bundy's teeth, a chip on the lateral surface of one of his upper front teeth, a slight rotational misalignment of another, and a distinctive double bite pattern where the upper and lower arches had overlapped. The impressions had been photographed at the crime scene. A dental mold had been taken of Bundy's teeth by court order. Souviron overlaid them for the jury on a large display board, point by point. The defense challenged the science. They argued that bite mark analysis was insufficiently standardized, that the impressions had degraded, that the match was subjective. The argument was not without merit. Bite mark evidence has since been the subject of significant scientific scrutiny in the decades that followed, and has been successfully challenged in other cases. But in July 1979, in a Tallahassee courtroom, the jury deliberated for 7 hours and returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. On July 24, 1979, Theodore Bundy was sentenced to death for the murders of Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman. The judge, Edward Cowart, delivered the sentence in a tone that many observers found remarkable, measured, almost regretful, acknowledging that Bundy was, in his view, a man of considerable intelligence who had made choices that led him to this moment. It was a strange grace note at the end of a proceeding that had lasted weeks. 3 months later, in Orlando, Bundy was tried separately for the murder of Kimberly Leach. The evidence in that case was different in character. Fiber transfers from the white van to Kimberly's clothing, a witness who had seen a man matching Bundy's description near the school that morning, a semen sample that matched his blood type, and a credit card receipt placing him in Lake City on the morning of February 8th. The jury convicted him in February 1980. He received a second death sentence. He spent 9 years on death row at Florida State Prison in Rayford, in a cell block called Q Wing, where the fluorescent lights ran 24 hours a day, and the temperature in the summer rarely dropped below 80 degrees. During those years, he gave interviews to investigators from multiple states, long structured sessions in which he described crimes in the third person at first, then gradually shifted to first-person accounts. He confessed in those final years to 30 murders across 7 states: Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, Florida, and California. Most investigators who worked those cases believe the actual number was higher. Some estimates based on geographic patterns and unsolved missing persons cases from the early 1970s place the total closer to 40. He never gave a complete accounting. He described some sites in enough detail to allow investigators to find remains. Others he described vaguely or not at all. There were cases he acknowledged in general terms and then refused to discuss further. He understood, even at the end, that information was leverage. On January 24, 1989, Theodore Bundy was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison. He was 42 years old. The execution was scheduled for 7 a.m. Outside the prison walls, along the road that ran past the facility, a crowd had gathered through the night. Something unusual, even by the standards of high-profile executions. People had driven from across Florida and from neighboring states. They held signs. Some had brought portable radios to hear the announcement. When the word came through that the execution had been carried out, there was noise from the crowd. Not quite celebration, but something close to it. A release of something that had been held for a long time. Robert Keppel, the King County detective, who had first mapped the pattern in 1974, who had spent 15 years building the investigative framework that eventually connected the cases, was one of the investigators who had traveled to Rayford in the days before the execution to conduct final interviews. He sat across from Bundy in a small room with a table between them and asked about cases that had never been solved, about locations in Washington state where remains had never been found. Bundy was cooperative in those sessions in a way he had never been during the trials. He gave directions. He described terrain. He named locations that Keppel had never heard him mention before. Keppel later wrote about those conversations at length. He said that even in those final hours, even knowing that the execution date was set and the appeals were exhausted, Bundy was performing. He was calculating what to give and what to withhold, managing the flow of information the same way he had managed every interaction for 30 years. The cooperation was real. Some of what he described led to recoveries, but it was also strategic. He was still, at the very end, trying to be the most important person in the room. Carol Duranch, the woman who had thrown herself out of his car on a November night in 1974, did not attend the execution. She had rebuilt her life in the years since, married, had children, moved to a different city, built a different future. She gave occasional interviews, and in each of them she said some version of the same thing, that what happened in that car had never felt like luck to her. It had felt like a decision. She had 30 seconds and she used them. That was all. Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler, the two Chi Omega survivors who had been beaten in their beds on January 15th, 1978, also rebuilt their lives. Karen Chandler spoke rarely and publicly about the case in the decades that followed. Kathy Kleiner was more visible. She gave interviews, participated in documentaries, and described in careful detail the physical recovery, the broken jaw wired shut for 6 weeks, the reconstructive surgery, the months of headaches, the years of nightmares in which she woke up not knowing where she was. And she described, alongside all of that, the long and deliberate process of refusing to let that night define the whole of who she was. Cheryl Thomas, the dance student who had been attacked in her apartment 8 blocks from the sorority house, lost the hearing in her left ear completely, and the vestibular function that had made her a dancer. She adapted. She became a dance teacher. She taught for decades at a studio in Florida. She kept teaching long after the case had faded from the news cycle, long after the documentaries and the books and the films had moved on to the next story. The Bundy case changed law enforcement in ways that are still visible today, and it is worth being specific about what those changes were and where they came from. The investigation in King County in 1974 exposed the fundamental structural problem of siloed jurisdictions. Cases that looked unrelated because they were being investigated by different agencies with no shared database, no shared language, and no mechanism for recognizing a pattern that crossed county lines, let alone state lines. A disappearance in Seattle and a disappearance in Corvallis and a disappearance in Murray, Utah were 3 separate cases in 3 separate filing systems. The name Ted Bundy appeared in the King County tip file in the fall of 1974 and did not travel to Utah. It did not travel to Colorado. It sat in a drawer. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, which had been operating out of Quantico, Virginia since the early 1970s, used the Bundy case as one of the foundational studies in what they were then developing as a framework for understanding what they called organized versus disorganized offenders. The profiling methodology that emerged from those years, the systematic analysis of crime scene behavior, victimology, and geographic patterns to build an investigative profile of an unknown offender was built in significant part on the documented behavior of Theodore Bundy and a small number of other cases from the same era. Robert Keppel worked directly with the unit during and after the investigation. The case also accelerated the development of what eventually became the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, a national database launched by the FBI in 1985 that allowed law enforcement agencies across the country to cross-reference violent crimes by method, victimology, and geography. The specific problem that had made Bundy invisible for so long, the inability to see one case hiding inside dozens of separate files in dozens of separate agencies, was the exact problem VICAP was designed to solve. It was not a perfect solution, and it took years to become widely used, but its existence traces directly back to the lessons of cases like this one. The bite mark evidence in the Chi Omega trial became a landmark case in forensic odontology. It was groundbreaking for 1979. It was also the beginning of a long and still unresolved debate about the reliability of forensic pattern matching disciplines, bite marks, hair analysis, tool mark comparison, that continues to play out in courts and in the scientific literature today. Some convictions built on similar evidence have since been overturned. The Bundy trial's use of bite marks as central evidence did not resolve that debate. It opened it, and the two escapes from the Pitkin County Courthouse in June 1977 and from the Garfield County Jail 6 months later led to sweeping changes in how high-security detainees are managed in transit, in courtrooms, and in detention facilities. The specific vulnerabilities that Bundy had exploited, unsupervised access to a courthouse law library, an unmaintained ceiling access panel, holiday staffing reductions that left a cell block effectively unmonitored, were addressed in jails and courthouses across the country in the years that followed. Physical security audits became standard. Transfer protocols were tightened. The assumption that a cooperative, articulate defendant was a manageable one was quietly retired. What the case could not fix was the year between 1974 and 1975, when the name Theodore Bundy appeared in the King County tip file and was noted and set aside. Multiple callers, the same name, and still the investigation moved in other directions, because there were 3,000 other names in the same file, and because in 1974 there was no frameworks for understanding what kind of person Bundy was, or how to weight the evidence against him. The reasons for that are complicated and documented and not reducible to a single failure. In 1974, the concept of a mobile, organized, socially functional offender who committed crimes across wide geographic areas, left almost no physical evidence, and chose victims entirely at random, no prior relationship, no discernible motive in the conventional sense, was not yet part of the investigative vocabulary in the way it is today. Detectives were trained to look for connection between victim and offender, for physical evidence tying a specific person to a specific scene, for the kind of motive that made sense within a known framework. Bundy's crimes had almost none of those markers. He was a stranger to every victim. He left almost nothing behind. He moved across state lines between crimes. He was, in the language that investigators would develop later, a new kind of problem, and the tools available in 1974 were not built to detect him. That gap between what the case required and what the system had is where the story actually lives. Not in the courtroom, not in the execution chamber, but in the years before any of that, when a detective in King County was looking at a stack of manila folders and trying to find a pattern that the system wasn't designed to show him. He found it anyway. It just took longer than it should have. And in that gap, there were names. There were women who were alive in the spring of 1974 and gone by the summer. Women with classes to attend and friends to call and plans for the following weekend. The investigation that eventually led to conviction was real and important and changed how law enforcement works. But it also came too late for them. That is the part of this case that doesn't resolve. The conviction happened, the execution happened, the reforms happened, and the women who disappeared from college campuses and parking lots and ski resort hallways in the early 1970s are still gone. Their names, Linda Ann Healy, Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball, Georgian Hawkins, Janice Ott, Denise Naslin, Nancy Wilcox, Melissa Smith, Laura Aim, Karen Campbell, Julie Cunningham, Denise Oliverson, Melanie Cooley, Shelley Robertson, Nancy Baird, Lisa Levy, Margaret Bowman, Kimberly Leach, and those are only the confirmed ones. If this case stayed with you, the investigative failures, the years it took to build the evidence, the question of what was missed and why, there's another case on this channel that follows a similar thread, a different state, a different decade, and a different kind of offender, but the same core problem, a pattern hiding in plain sight, and the people who finally found it. That one is waiting for you next